Welcome back to Bike Matters. Today we're looking at a highly accessible budget middleweight from Suzuki. It's the SV650. One of the immediate strengths of the SV650 is the tried and tested engine. It's a 645cc liquid-cooled V-twin, and as of the latest update, it's now fully Euro 5 compliant. It'll put out a claimed 72 brake horsepower at 8,500 RPM, and it's got 64 newton meters of torque at 6,800 RPM. So there's plenty of performance here, especially for UK road riding. It'll reach the national speed limit nice and swiftly, and it can cruise on those dual carriageways, no problem at all. The next obvious strength for me is in the styling. While most of its rivals have kind of gone for this very futuristic look, it's a much more classic design here, and the new paint jobs that they've put on this back in 2021 look absolutely phenomenal for me. We've got it in white here, and we've got this lovely sort of metallic crimson frame and wheels that really pops out. You can get it in a matte black with a blue metallic frame, or you can get it in a gloss black with a gold frame. All three look tremendous, so take your pick. I am definitely a fan of the way this bike looks, and if you're looking for that more sort of classic traditional style, then this does stand out on its own amongst some of its major rivals. Now, while we're on the subject of style, there's also the SV650X. Now, they're essentially the exact same bike, all the same components, the same engine. So most of what I'm going to say in this review can be applied to both the SV650 and the SV650X. The main difference is the X comes with clip-on bars, it's got a cool little front fairing, it's got a retro-looking seat, and it just gives it a kind of cafe racer vibe. But when it comes to the way the bike performs, it's pretty much the same as one of these. Now, one thing to bear in mind is if you do want to opt for the 650X version, it is an extra 400 quid, but we'll talk about that later. For brakes, we've got a 240mm disc on the rear and twin 290mm discs up front with twin pot calipers. Now, the brakes I would describe as being adequate. They get the job done, nothing stand out. You do, with the levers, need to crunch it on a little bit. Some bikes I've ridden in this category, you just need a couple of fingers and it instantly responds, but with this, you just need to squeeze it a little bit harder. But once you do squeeze it down, it will get you stopped relatively swiftly, so the brakes are absolutely fine. For suspension, we've got a 41mm telescopic fork on the front. It's not adjustable, but for this price point, that's what you'd expect. On the rear, we've got a preload adjustable monoshock. When it comes to how the performance of the suspension is in the real world when you're riding it, again, similar to the brakes, I'd describe it as adequate. It's not amazing, but it's certainly not bad. We're in Norfolk, so there's a lot of lumpy, bumpy roads, and I did push it along the back roads. And when you hit a bump, you do feel it on this. It bounced me around a little bit, but nothing too extreme. Overall, I would say the suspension is fine. We've got a 14.5 litre tank here, which is decent, and I actually think that the fuel economy is pretty good here. Now, Suzuki claim you can reach about 69 mpg, which is pretty good for a bike like this. I think if you're riding it a little bit more aggressively, which most people probably are, I think you'll still get around 60 mpg. So it does have a slight advantage over some of its competition there. I think it's going to be quite cheap and economical to run. So the SV650 is a very accessible bike, and it's accessible in a whole plethora of ways. One of those ways, straight away, is the seat height. It's only 785mm, so it's pretty ideal for shorter riders. I'm around average height, I'm 5'10", I can flat foot it no problem, but Brett's a little bit shorter than me. He actually got in it and he just about managed to flat foot it as well. I think on the other side of the scale, if you're a taller rider, definitely check it for your legroom. It might feel a little bit cramped, but I think for shorter riders and average height riders, it's going to be pretty spot on. The SV650 with a full tank of fuel weighs in at 200 kilos, so it's a little bit on the heavy side for this category. Once you're away and riding, it's not exactly cumbersome. It's still pretty agile and feels pretty comfortable to ride, but it's just a little bit heavier than some of its rivals, and you can feel that when you're out on the road. When it comes to the spec, it keeps things relatively basic. There's not much in the way of high-tech features. We don't even have LED lights. There's no ride modes or anything like that. It's got ABS as standard, but that's mandatory these days. One thing it does have is Suzuki have put this low RPM assist in there, and it does actually work. What it does is it just keeps the revs up at low speeds and makes it a lot harder to stall. And I tested it in first gear. I got it as low as 6 miles per hour, still didn't need to hit that clutch, and there was no sign of any stalling. You can pull away in second gear. It just adds to how user-friendly the bike is. I do feel like it's definitely aimed towards the newer riders, and little touches like that just make it a little bit more manageable and a little more easy to use. So we've got an LCD dash. It's pretty basic, but we've got a nice large speedo, and I do like that. I want to be able to just glance down and see exactly where I'm at. There's a fuel indicator underneath it, which shows where you are on the fuel, and it's also got an estimated mile range as well. So it'll tell you how many miles you're going to be able to do on your remaining fuel, which is a pretty cool feature. We've got a gear indicator, which is always nice, but aside from that, it's just the basics. The switchgear, also just the basics. It feels pretty good. Not the most expensive switchgear in the world, but it doesn't feel cheap either. It's pretty comfortable. And what I do like about this switchgear is it all feels very intuitive to use. You know, everything's just there at the end of your thumb. No problem finding anything without looking. Yeah, all feels pretty comfortable, so I'm happy with all of that. Let's talk about some of the strong points of the SV650. Straight away, the first one is going to be the price. It's £6,999 brand new, and that means that amongst the budget middleweight bikes, it's one of the cheapest ones out there. And when you combine that with its great fuel economy, I do think it's a good option for anyone who's looking to save a bit of money, and they want a bike that can commute, that can be a runaround, that can still have some fun when you're out riding it. It can kind of do all those things, and it's relatively cheap. Now, if you're wanting to upgrade to that SV650X, which has the Cafe Racer styling, I say upgrade, it's the same performance-wise, it just has a different look to it. That is an extra 400 quid. So when you're upping the price to that point, perhaps some of this value for money starts to disappear. But, you know, if you want a bike that looks that way, you usually do have to pay for it, so something to think about there. Now, the budget middleweight naked category is absolutely stacked right now. I've already mentioned some of the rivals. We've got the Yamaha MT-07, we've got the Triumph Trident, of course, we've got Kawasaki Z650. They've all been updated recently, and I feel like the Suzuki 650 has kind of been left behind a little bit, especially with this 200 kilo weight. To put that into perspective, the MT-07 is 16 kilos lighter, and you do feel that when you're riding it. You know, it's just a little bit more agile, it's got more pull to it, it's a little bit faster all the way across the spectrum. It just performs a little bit better across the board. However, I feel like Suzuki aren't necessarily trying to compete with these bikes. Where this bike really shines is from a beginner perspective. It's extremely easy to ride, it's extremely forgiving. We've got a lovely forgiving clutch. The power delivery is really smooth and linear. There's no surprises, no power bands or anything like that. The gearbox is effortless. It changes gear really easily, really precisely. And I already talked about the low RPM mode, which makes it extremely hard to stall. So if you're a new rider looking for your first big bike perhaps, I feel like this is pretty much perfect. On the other side, if you're coming out perhaps from an A2 bike, looking to get a slightly larger machine, if you're an experienced rider looking to have a little bit of fun on something that maybe do a commute as well, then you're probably better off looking elsewhere, because some of the other bikes have just got more in terms of raw power. Now, one final thing I'll say is, this bike does have that V-twin engine, so it has that going for it. It's tried, it's tested, it feels great, and it has an amazing exhaust note. Especially in the mid-range, when you crank that throttle, you hear that throaty growl, and none of the other bikes in the category really have that. So it's got that going for it. Combined with the overall looks and aesthetics, I feel like if you put a pipe on this thing, it would sound delightful. So what do you guys think about the SV650? Is it the best beginner bike out there? It's certainly a contender. How do you think it compares to some of the other bikes in this category? I'd love to hear. Leave us a comment down below. I'll check them all out. For me, I think it's an excellent beginner choice. It's forgiving, it's easy to ride, very difficult to get into trouble on one of these, but it still has plenty of power for UK riding. I feel its only weakness is in terms of raw performance, it's just starting to fall behind some of those class leaders right now. So it could be time for Suzuki to give it a little bit of an update. But if you are a beginner looking for a first big bike, this could be pretty ideal. All right guys, if you enjoyed this video or found it at all helpful, do me a favor and hit that thumbs up button. We've got plenty more content on the channel, plenty more content on the way, so feel free to subscribe, ring the bell, and I'll see you in the next one.